is the hero. He has defeated an Italian army. He has conquered Italy, organized an army, and he's also brought back an awful lot of treasures to Paris. He has taken the artworks from Italy and brought them back to Paris. So he is the hero. He comes back to Paris, conquering hero, 29 years old, top of the world. And the director, who is running the government, says to him, your next task is to invade England. Now, Bonaparte is infantry. He is not a sailor. So he doesn't want to do that, right? England is, of course, the enemy of France at this time. He looks at the boats and says, they're inadequate. We're not going to invade England, right? But he has another plan. He suggests, I'll go and conquer Egypt. Now, there's several reasons why conquering Egypt is a reasonable thing for Bonaparte to say. One is, politically, it was the worst thing you could do to England is conquer Egypt. Why? This was England's land route to India. English trade depended on controlling Egypt. And if the French controlled Egypt, English economy was dead. So he was going to strike a blow at England by going to Egypt. The other reason he wanted to go, I think, was personal. Alexander the Great was always his hero. And Alexander the Great began the great career of his by conquering Egypt. And he even said, all greatness starts in the East. Right? So he wanted to conquer Egypt, I think, because Alexander the Great had done it. Now, also, I think he wanted to see the place. He was a person like we are. He was also a scholar, by the way. Don't think of Napoleon, as this crude guy. Not at all. He was a member of the French Institute in Mathematics. He was a bit of a culture vulture. Wherever he went, he would draw up lists of artworks to be requisitioned. Right? He was an okay guy. As a matter of fact, our system of numbering the streets, odd-numbered houses on one side, even-numbered on another? That was Napoleon's idea. He got lost one night, ticked off, he couldn't find a house. We're going to number odd, number, and even number. But Napoleon was really somebody to be reckoned with. Right? So he was off to Egypt. The year is 1798. Now, what was known about Egypt in 1798? Not much. Hieroglyphs, right, hadn't been deciphered yet. Right? And remember, by the way, the word is hieroglyphs. The carving you see on the walls are not hieroglyphics. That's an adjective, right? It's a hieroglyphic writing. It's a hieroglyphic script. But the ducks and birds are hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs hadn't been deciphered. So a lot of the history was unknown. There was no systematic attempt at organizing the knowledge that was known. For example, there weren't museums with large collections of Egyptian antiquities. The closest thing to a museum collection was what were cabinets of curiosities. These were wealthy people in Europe had little cabinets, literally like a china closet, in their houses where they would have curiosities. It might be a mummy's arm brought back from Egypt by a sea captain.
Why, hello.
It might be a two-headed baby in a jar. Right? These were the cabinets of curiosities that wealthy people you would come.
What's
and
good?
Let me show you my cabinet. Right?
What is that?
So
Moldy ant? That's funny.
As we had. So Bonaparte was sailing off into sort of uncharted waters. He was really doing something new. Now, also, the information that had been gained about Egypt came from unprofessional sources. What I mean by that is you get missionaries going to do missionary work, and they'd come back and report. They weren't trained observers. They had their own agendas. So you don't often get an objective reporting. Or sometimes it would be a sea captain who sailed up the Nile and would describe what he saw. In 1737, two sea captains went to Egypt. One by the name of Pocock, the other Norden. Norden was a Danish and Pocock was English. We don't know that they even talked to each other. They were in Egypt at the same time, and I figured out their ships probably crossed in the Nile. But each one wrote a description of Egypt. And what you get are kind of drawings that are unprofessional. I mean, Norden's looked like he never left the ship. They're little tiny pyramids across the water, and almost like he never got off his boat. So you never had a really good description of this country, Egypt, that Napoleon was sailing for. Bonaparte was going to change all that. He took with him 150 artists, scientists, and it was an all-star team. Now, let me say this. It wasn't easy to recruit these guys. Why? His destination was a secret. When he sailed from France in 1798, he took 55,000 soldiers with him. Right? 55,000. And practically none of them knew where they were going. Incredible, but true. Only the captains, of course, of the ships, of the fleet knew. He'd kept it a secret, and many of the scientists didn't know where they were going. They were merely recruited for a great experience. So when they sailed, there was a lot of rumor. Some people thought, well, maybe we're going to the Holy Land, which was close. But nobody knew for sure. They started at Malta, by the way. They stopped along the way at Malta to conquer Malta, because Malta was strategically important. And great stories about what happened. Malta was controlled by the Knights of Malta. But they were an old, kind of rusty organization. They were old men who didn't really want to fight. And it took 2 days, and he was in control of Malta. He quickly took all the treasures of the Knights of Malta, right? Which included, by the way, life-size silver statues, 12 of them, of the apostles. They've never been seen again. They disappeared. The only thing he left for the Knights was a splinter from the True Cross. That's what he left them. But after Malta, he sailed for Egypt with his all-star crew. Now, let me tell you about some of these guys. Vivant Denon was probably the second oldest member of the group. They were young. He was in his 50s, Denon. But he was a professional artist and a friend of Bonaparte, and he's later going to become the first director of the Louvre, right? The first director of the museum when it's founded. First started out as Musée Napoléon, by the way. Denon went along as an artist, but there was also Berthollet, the chemist, right? And Napoleon had known him before, and he called him my chemist, right? So Berthollet was the chemist. He also took along with him guys like Geoffroy St. Hilaire, who was a great naturalist, young, up and coming. You know who was there? The mathematician, Fourier, as in the Fourier transformations. He was there. The mineralogist, Dolomieu, after whom we have the mineral dolomite named, he was there. There was Monge, who was a great mathematician. It was an amazing crew. Even Redoute, who was a brother of the famous Redoute who painted roses, right, to do the botanical drawings. He was going to describe all of Egypt. Now, along with these sort of senior scientists, and most of them were professors, came a younger crew of students. Now, these guys were professors at the École Polytechnique, for example. So they brought with them students. Hey, I'm going on, you're 19 years old, come on, we're going. And you would have young students along. So many of the people there were like 17, 18. I mean, there's even one kid who took his books along. He was 17 years old when he left, took his books along, studied in Cairo, and the next year he was examined and he became an engineer. He was graduated in Cairo, right? So it was an exciting adventure for the savants. But there was a war to fight, right? Napoleon still had to conquer Egypt. So he leaves in 1798, conquers Malta, and then there's a war to fight. Now, he lands his man near Alexandria. All is well. But one of the things about this campaign that sort of reveals Bonaparte's personality, he was always impatient. I mean, he was a genius, and he was brilliant, but he was impatient. They landed in August, right? Summer. It's hot. They have woolen uniforms and no canteens. They had not prepared for a desert campaign. And the first thing they do when they march from Alexandria to Cairo, the desert road, they start dying of thirst. The locals had filled in the wells, right? So there were no water. Men shot themselves. They were in such agony. Right? Now Bonaparte, when he landed, was trying to explain to the people that I'm your friend. I'm not going to conquer. Now, understand the political situation in Egypt at the time. Egypt was not being ruled by the Egyptians per se. The Turks had official control of Egypt. And the Turks had as their kind of janissaries, their emissaries in Egypt, the Mamelukes. Now, Mameluk is a word that means bought man. The Mamelukes were originally bought as slaves from the Circassian Mountains as young boys, and they were trained to be soldiers in Egypt. Eventually, they revolted. They became soldiers, revolted, and now the Mamelukes were in charge. And they were tyrannizing the peasants, taxing them heavily. And Bonaparte lands, and he issues a proclamation to the Egyptians. We come here to free you. Now remember, this is just after the French Revolution. We're talking liberté, égalité, fraternité. And that's what he's preaching to these people. And he says, we're going to liberate you from the Turks. Interesting, by the way, the very first document ever published in Arabic in Egypt was Napoleon's proclamation. He brought the printing presses, the first Arabic printing presses to Egypt. And where did he get the typeface? They raided the Vatican. They went to the Vatican, took all the typeface, brought it over with printing presses, with 2 printers, and they were set up to print. Right, so the first documents he got published in Arabic, Napoleon. But anyway, we got to get to the war. They march to Cairo. Eventually they make it to Cairo. Men kill themselves. It's a terrible situation. And they are just about hanging on by their fingernails. And they are about to fight the battle of their lives. The Battle of the Pyramids. There are 2 major battles fought in Egypt. The Battle of the Pyramids and the Battle of the Nile. Neither one is accurate. They're both misnamed. The Battle of the Pyramids was not by the pyramids, and the Battle of the Nile was not by the Nile. But we'll get to the Battle of the Nile in a minute. The Battle of the Pyramids was fought in a melon patch, about 6 or 7 miles from the pyramids, in a place now called Mbaba. There's a camel market there now. But you could see the pyramids in the distance. And the Mamelukes had been massing their forces. So you were going to get a clash, for the first time in history, of a modern Western fighting army, Napoleon's, with an Eastern fighting force, but they were very, very different. The Mamelukes were all cavalry. The typical Mameluke, and these were, really great-looking guys. They had turbans, they had flowing robes, they all had these wonderful horses. They all had 2 pistols, swords, and a servant or 2 running behind. So what they would do is they would go into battle with their horses, with their pistols, fire their pistols, throw them over their shoulders. The servants would grab them, reload them, find them in the battle, give them back their pistols, and it would all continue again. So we were going to get these very brave Mamelukes, skilled horsemen, fighting Napoleon's disciplined army. A lot of these guys had been with him in Italy and knew it worked. They had never lost. Right? Napoleon had never lost a battle. So the Battle of the Pyramids is about to be fought. Napoleon has his men form squares. You have riflemen on the outside. You have artillery on the corners, and the cavalry is inside the square. The Mamelukes are about to charge. Probably about more than 5,000. We're not sure of the exact numbers because they get exaggerated, but certainly more than 5,000. Napoleon's squares are formed. And just before the battle, Napoleon points to the pyramids. You can see them in the distance. And he says, "Soldiers, from these heights, 40 centuries of history looks down upon you." Now, the remarkable thing is, he was about right. The pyramids were about 40 centuries old. And you wonder how he knew it, because remember, it hadn't been studied yet. It was a really educated guess. And the battle began. It was quickly over. The Mamelukes charged. And the squares held their fire until the Mamelukes were right on top of them. And they just blew them away. The Mamelukes retreated, massed again, another charge, and it was clear they were no match for a Western army. The Mamelukes were done with. Now, the army was quite happy about this, not just because they won the battle, but these Mamelukes carried their wealth with them. They often had gold coins sewn into their turbans. So right after the battle, there was a tremendous amount of looting. These Mamelukes were on the battlefield dead, and they had inlaid, swords inlaid with gold. They had pistols that were fantastic. So the army did quite well. And now Napoleon was in charge of Cairo. Right? He had conquered. But his victory wasn't going to last very long. Because let me tell you what happened with the next battle, the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon establishes himself quickly in Cairo. They take over the houses of the Mamelukes. Things are going well. And then comes Horatio Nelson, the English admiral, who had been looking for Napoleon's fleet. Now, nobody really knew where Napoleon was going, so they'd been searching around. They heard he'd been in Malta. They tried other places. Napoleon had his fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. The admiral, Admiral Brie, had suggested, don't anchor here. It's not good protection. Let's take the fleet away to Corfu, to go away from Egypt. Bonaparte was an infantryman. Didn't understand having your fleet away from where you need it. He said, no, anchor here. So Brie did a smart thing. He anchored as close to shore as he could, so that nobody finding him could go between him and shore. And he pointed all his guns seaward. So if an attack came from the sea, from the Mediterranean, he could fire. 13 ships of the line, they're called. Those are the fighting ships. were not the transport ships. There were 13 ships of the line anchored in Aboukir Bay. And Nelson sails into Aboukir Bay, and Caesar just lined up. Now, Nelson did two things that had never been done in the history of naval warfare. The first thing was, when he sees them, it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's going to get dark fairly soon. And naval battles are not fought at night. At least they weren't then. Normally, you would wait for the next day. Not Nelson. Boom. Sails right in and starts the battle. So you know that the battle's going to be mostly at night. The next thing he does is he sails in between the ships and the shore. Something was thought impossible. He had no charts of that shore. He had no idea how deep it was. But he told his men, go right in. And they did it. They could do it. So now you've got the ships between the French and the shore. The British are there. All the guns are pointed seaward. And those French ships are sitting ducks. They can't turn the guns. It's not an era when you can turn cannon around very easily. Napoleon's entire fleet was destroyed in one day. Right? The battle went through the night. The largest ship in the history of the world at that point was the L'Orient, Napoleon's flagship. When that ship blew up, it was heard 20 miles away. It's a famous explosion. When the ship blew up, everybody was so shocked that the fighting stopped for 10 minutes. They just kind of didn't believe it. It was at night. It was dark. Also, some of you may remember, some of you may be old enough to remember a poem that I had to learn when I was a kid. It begins, "The boy stood on the burning deck." That is about a young boy who was the captain's son, Casabianca's son, who when the ship blew up, he refused to leave the ship because his father wasn't there, and he went down with the ship. Right? That's about the Egyptian campaign. So Bonaparte now, his fleet is destroyed. He is stranded in Egypt. Nelson, he's a naval man. He's not a military. He's not an infantry guy. Nelson says, Bonaparte's in a fix that he's not going to get out of. And he simply sailed away, leaving Bonaparte stranded. He couldn't get reinforcements. He couldn't get new supplies. He was in trouble. Didn't faze Bonaparte. What does he do? He founds an institute to study Egypt, right? His fleet is gone. He founds this institute. Now, fortunately, one of the people with him was a guy named Conti. Conti was a guy who could do anything. He was an engineer. And what Bonaparte once said of him was, he has all the arts in his hands, all the science in his head. Now, when the ships went down, they lost a lot of equipment. Surveying equipment, scientific instruments, all kinds of things. Conti could make it. He could recreate almost anything. So Conti helped, and they set up workshops and all that. And the amazing thing is, as this war is going on, the 150 scientists are going about their job of studying Egypt. Right? They're drawing plants. They're studying animals. They're uncovering Egypt. Right? Now, it's a good thing that they had Conti, because when Bonaparte came into Egypt, there were no places where you could buy things like microscopes, telescopes. They had silk bazaars. That's what they had. So they are doing the best they can. Now Bonaparte heads out for another battle. He heads out to Acre, which was in Syria then. It's in modern-day Israel. And this is the battle where Napoleon suffers his first real loss, Napoleon himself. Aboukir was a disaster, but it wasn't his baby. Acre was controlled by a man named Djezer Pasha. Now, Djezer means the butcher. He was called the butcher because he was not a nice man. I'll give you an example. Djezer had a physician whose name was Hayam the Jew. And Hayam was asked to examine one of Djezer's wives to find out if the woman was pregnant, to find out if the wife was going to have a boy or a girl. Now, how was Hayam going to do this? He wasn't even allowed to examine the woman. She would put her hand through a hole in the wall. He would look at her hand, and he had to tell Djezer whether it was a boy or a girl. So Hayam took a guess. Djezer, anxious to find out, had the woman brought and cut open so he could see whether the fetus was a boy or a girl. Hayam guessed wrong and lost an ear, right? And eventually lost an eye. Djezer was not a nice person. Now, Napoleon was going to do battle with Djezer. And it's at the fort of Acre where he loses this battle. Now, understand that Acre is on the water. It's a fort. And the way you normally take a fort is either by starving it out, you camp around it, don't let it get supplies, or you siege it, you charge, make a breach in the wall, and go in. They couldn't starve it out because it's on the water and the British were supplying Jejer Pasha with supplies. So that wouldn't work. So Napoleon had to siege the fort. But he didn't wait for his cannons to come up, and they kept charging the fort. The men would die. It was a terrible, terrible situation for the French army. And not only were they losing the battle because of Jejer Pasha being reinforced and just shooting cannon at him one after the other, the plague had struck. The French started dying of the plague, bubonic plague. So they were really fighting two battles, the military one and this medical one. Now, while this is going on, as I say, the scientists are recording all of Egypt. A remarkable thing. 150 men doing the best they can. Now, by 1798, right, Napoleon knew he was defeated. He marches back from Acre. Marches back. Comes in victorious, by the way. He marches in victoriously into Cairo. They get the healthy ones in front. They march in. They say, yeah, we conquered. Comes in. Always spinning his own legend. Comes in. But Bonaparte knew it was over. It's now 1799, and he's making plans to leave. Bonaparte does not tell his men. He leaves a letter for General Kléber, his next in charge, who says, and it says, by the time you read this, I'll be on a ship heading for Paris. It says, there are the developments in France that call me, I must leave. Kléber is really ticked off. I mean, he's got a losing war. But Bonaparte left with Denon, the artist, and a few other people. And what does he do when he returns? He declares himself a hero. He has medals struck, showing that he is the conqueror of Egypt, right? He's founded an institute. He's come back, and he has medals struck saying, I've conquered Egypt. I mean, it's amazing. The British knew the truth, though, and they had cartoons, wonderful cartoons of Napoleon's scientists studying crocodiles. I mean, there's one great one that shows one of the scientists being bitten by a crocodile, and the book that's fallen out of his arm says Les droits de crocodile, the rights of crocodiles, right? And they're sort of lampooning that while this war is going on, these guys got their heads in another world. But it was the beginning of modern Egyptology, right? Even though Napoleon is declaring himself a hero returning, and he's not a hero, lots of things are going to happen. First, when they get back, eventually, there's a truce, 1801. The scientists are going to return, and they are going to publish what is probably the greatest publication in the history of the world up till then, the Description de l'Egypte. It's 10 huge volumes of engravings. It's the first time that the West saw Egypt accurately depicted. It's fantastic. It shows the temples. It shows everything. This is the first time that the West is going to realize that pyramids aren't that pointy. You know, always you had people who describing things that hadn't even seen it, doing drawings. The Description de l'Egypte showed it all. Not only that, they brought back collections. These guys were professionals. They were artists. They were engineers who could measure and draw carefully. They brought back collections of antiquities that had never been assembled. It was the first coherent attempt at assembling a collection. I mean, it's remarkable what they did. Now, when the thing was published, the Description de l'Egypte was published, it was a sensation. People started a fad, which we call Egyptomania. For example, furniture started to have legs in the shape of mummies, right? Wrapped up mummies. And women used to wear their hairdos. They called it à l'Egyptienne, right? In what they thought were Egyptian ways. But it was also important for the zoologists. They had brought back their specimens. Now, it's an amazing story how these guys ever got their specimens back. Think about it. They had lost the war. When the British came in 1801 to work out the treaty, the deal was the following. All antiquities go back to England. Everything the French had collected was British property. That was the treaty. The scientists all said, now these are guys who had spent 2 years under horrible conditions, collecting their birds, collecting the plants, collecting everything they wanted. The scientists, the zoologists, the botanists, they all said, we'd rather go back to England with our collections and lose them. They weren't going to let their collections go. Now the British were really quite decent about it. They said, no, you can take your collections with you. And they let the French go back with their collections. It was really a rather magnanimous thing. And this became the beginnings of modern collections for museums. When museums would send out expeditions to collect, This is where it all comes from. I mean, think how audacious it was for Bonaparte, going off to fight a war. And what does he do? In addition, he takes 150 scientists and says, oh, we're going to do a scientific study. He was going to colonize Egypt. That was his intention. It was going to become a French colony. So, really, from Bonaparte's military campaign, we're starting to see the beginnings, just the beginnings, of modern Egyptology. Now, let me say something about how they made the recordings. As I said before, the ancient Egyptian language was a dead language. Nobody could read it. Nobody. As a matter of fact, nobody even thought that it contained any history, that it might contain records of the kings, that it might contain, annals of military expeditions. Nobody ever thought that. It was always believed to be purely religious. Because think about the name, hieroglyphs, hieros, sacred carvings. Because only the priests could read them in Egypt. That was the literate class. So everybody thought these were just religious texts, right? But Bonaparte had instructed his men, the scientists, some of them were linguists. He had instructed them to copy the hieroglyphs accurately. And there were many men who did nothing but copy hieroglyphs. And they're done so accurately. I can pick up a page of the Description de l'Egypte. I can pick up a page. And I can look at the hieroglyphs. And I can read them. And they didn't know what they were copying. Right? So it's really quite a remarkable achievement. And that is perhaps one of the most lasting things that Bonaparte achieved. The decipherment of hieroglyphs is going to come right out of this expedition. And let me tell you how. The English said, okay, you can keep the birds, you can keep the plants, but all the antiquities, they're ours. And that included one of the most crucial of all antiquities that Bonaparte's men found, the Rosetta Stone, the famous Rosetta Stone. It was found at a fort in the town of Rosetta, Rashid as it was called then, found in the town of Rosetta. And it was an interesting finding. It was found by a man named Bouchard, Lieutenant Bouchard. Everybody was looking for the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Everybody knew that maybe this expedition will lead to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. But when they found the Rosetta Stone, they knew immediately that this was going to be the key to decipherment. Why? Because it had the same inscription in two different languages. It had it in Egyptian, but it also had it in Greek. And the Greek inscription said it's the same inscription twice. Right? Actually 3 times, but I'll talk about that later. So the Rosetta Stone was going to be the key to decipherment of hieroglyphs. Bouchard found it. It was brought to Cairo. The savants looked at it and said, this is going to be the key. The scientists knew this was going to be the key. But the treaty said all the antiquities have to come to England. The French desperately tried to keep the Rosetta Stone. Desperately. The general who was now in charge, right? Remember, Bonaparte leaves, puts Kléber in charge. Kléber is assassinated soon after. And General Menou is now in charge. And Menou says, this is not part of the government's property. This is my personal property. So therefore you shouldn't have it. The English simply pointed a cannon at his head and said, we're taking it. And that is why today, the Rosetta Stone is not in the Louvre in Paris. It's in the British Museum in England, because Napoleon lost that campaign. And the Rosetta Stone was going to be the key. Fortunately, the French had made copies of the Rosetta Stone. They used it, it's inscribed, it's a stone that has carvings. So they used it as a printing stone. They inked it and ran paper over it and pressed it so that they had impressions of it. And scientists are scientists, they're not interested in war, they're not interested in nationality. They passed out copies to everybody who wanted it. So the French had copies of the Rosetta Stone at least. And this is what would lead to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. And it's all because of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, next time, we're going to talk about the Rosetta Stone and about the actual decipherment of ancient Egyptian. See you next time.
Lecture 5, the Rosetta Stone, and much more.
Hello again. Let me do a brief summary of what we did last time, because it leads directly into what I want to do today. Remember we talked about Napoleon's campaign when he went off to Egypt, and how he didn't just go for a military expedition, He took with him 150 scientists to study Egypt as it had never been studied before. No one had ever done anything like that. Now, what his campaign would be was a military disaster. He lost badly. But modern Egyptology came out of it. And in particular, we're most grateful for the Rosetta Stone. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I have a specific goal today. I'm even going to give you a little bit of homework. But don't worry, it's easy. Today, I want you to understand why the Rosetta Stone was the key to the decipherment of ancient Egyptian language. And I want you to know the different scripts that ancient Egyptian was written in. It was written in a hieroglyphic script, what's called a hieratic script, a Demotic script, a Coptic script, all words that you probably haven't heard, but that's okay. But by the end of the lesson, I think you'll understand them quite well. And my prediction is, and my goal is, that every one of you will be able to read and write your own name in hieroglyphs by the end of this lecture. So, let's see if it works. Now, let me first explain why ancient Egyptian became a dead language. Toward the end of Egypt's long history, 3,000 years of historic records, towards the end, Egypt was conquered by many foreign lands. And we'll talk about those later. The Assyrians, the Libyans, the Babylonians, the Nubians, towards the very end, the Greeks, and then finally the Romans. And because Egypt was eventually occupied by foreigners, the language died out. At one point, Greek became the major language of commerce. Then the Romans took over. So by 425 AD, we have the last inscription written on a wall in a temple in ancient Egyptian. That is the last time that we know that anybody could read or write ancient Egyptian. It was probably a priest. So after 425, no one could read ancient Egyptian records. And it remained a dead language. It remained a dead language for over 1,000 years. Now why? The answer is that everybody was making the same false assumption, that it was picture writing. Now think about it. Don't most people think of hieroglyphs as picture writing? That when you see birds and feet, like maybe you see feet walking, and it's talking about somebody going somewhere perhaps, and when you see birds, it's talking about birds, and when you see snakes, it's talking about snakes? No, that's wrong. Ancient Egyptian was basically an alphabetic language like ours. But everybody was assuming it was picture writing, so nobody was deciphering it. Interesting, by the way, think about this. If it really were picture writing, wouldn't we all be able to read it? Right? We'd all be able to read it. But no, it's not picture writing. It's mainly alphabetic. So for over 1,000 years, nobody could read or write it. There was a lot of speculation, I'll tell you that much. One Greek writer who had an interesting name, Horopolo, Horus and Apollo combined, and a Greek, wrote a treatise about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but he couldn't read them. He had no idea. And it's an interesting treatise. He got some things right, some things wrong. I'll give you an example. He says, and this is right, this is the right part. He says that a duck, when you see the hieroglyph of a duck, it was used by the ancient Egyptians
Hey, Rainer,
to
what's up,
indicate
dude?
someone's son, S-O-N, the child. That a duck represented a son. He was right. He was right. The reason he gave was, thinking it's picture writing, because the ducks fight so fiercely for its offspring. The duck was associated with children. That was really wrong. The duck indeed did represent a child, a male child. But the reason the duck represented it was that hieroglyph. And remember, it's a hieroglyph, not a hieroglyphic. That hieroglyph, it's a picture of a duck, merely is there because it's pronounced S-A. The duck represents a sound, sa, and that was the ancient Egyptian word for son. So when you look at a duck, when an Egyptian looked at a duck, he wasn't thinking about a duck. He was thinking about the sound sa, and that meant a male child. Right? So Horopolo had some right, some wrong, but there was an awful lot of speculation about what these sacred carvings meant, but nobody really knew. Now, the Rosetta Stone, as you'll remember from last time, it was found at a fort, Fort Rosetta. Napoleon's men were digging the fortifications, and buried into the wall of the fort was this stone, the Rosetta Stone. So whoever had built the fort originally Took this old stone that was around, good piece of building material, recycled it, put it inside the wall. Bouchard, the lieutenant who found it, was an educated man, saw there was Greek on it, saw there was ancient Egyptian. He knew this was going to be the key. And as I said last time, it was sent down to Cairo, and the scientists started studying it. Now, first, your trivia question, your Egyptological trivia question. How many languages on the Rosetta Stone? You've all heard of the Rosetta Stone, and I bet in high school you were taught, and I bet you were taught 3. That's wrong. The answer is only 2. There are 3 scripts on the Rosetta Stone, but only 2 languages, Egyptian and Greek. Those are the languages. But the Egyptian is written in 2 scripts. You know what it's like? We have, say, printed letters, Latin letters we call them, and cursive writing when we are writing a letter. That's what the Egyptians had also. They had different forms of writing. And on this Rosetta Stone are 3 different scripts. We have one, which is hieroglyphic, the hieroglyphic script. These are the hieroglyphs. These are the symbols that are recognizable as ducks and birds.
I am
This is
shopping
what
for
you can tell.
new farm birds.
Now,
I hope
in
you're
addition,
too.
the Egyptians had other scripts.
Nice,
One
man.
was called
What kind
Demotic.
of birds you getting?
That's also on the Rosetta
It's
Stone. Now, Demotic again comes from the
it's like 2 a.m. over here, so I'm trying to be a little quiet.
for the people. This is
I'm
the people's
I'm
writing. So in
cutting
other
some
words,
stuff for my cartoon.
hieroglyphs, the
I
sacred
just couldn't
coffins,
really fall
are
asleep.
used by the priests for religious texts and also used for official big statements by the pharaoh. When you put something on a temple wall about a victory, that was in hieroglyphs. But if you were writing, say, a laundry list or a grocery list or a receipt for goats, you did it in Demotic because it takes a long time to draw a bird and then a foot and then. So they had a quick way of writing it at the end of the Egyptian civilization called Demotic. So that also was on the Rosetta Stone. Now the third script and the second language was Greek. And that's one that scholars could read at the time. And the key was the last sentence of the Greek. It says, and I'll read it to you, written in sacred and native and Greek characters. In other words, that last line of the Greek inscription said, we've written the same message 3 ways. In sacred, hieroglyphic, native, meaning the people's writing, the Demotic, and Greek. So it was the same message written 3 different ways in 2 different languages. This was going to be the key to deciphering it. Let me say this. There are other forms of the Egyptian writing. There's one other important one for us called hieratic. Right? Again, sacred writing. This is a more cursive form of writing also. It's something in between Demotic and hieroglyphs. So for example, instead of writing the full bird, you might just write its head and then its tail feathers. So it's a quicker way of writing. So you have different scripts. You have the fancy one, hieroglyphs, which takes the longest. You have hieratic, which is pretty fast, and Demotic, which is really fast. There is even one more script in Egyptian history. And let me tell you about that one, because it's going to be the key to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Coptic. Now, Coptic, it comes from the Greek word. Right? Eventually, it comes from the Greek word for Egypt, Aegyptus. And Aegyptus became Copt, and that's Coptic. The Copts in Egypt, and they're there today, to this day you have Copts in Egypt, are the Christians, the Christian Egyptians. In the 1st century AD, St. Mark came into Egypt preaching the Trinity. Now, he was spreading Christianity, and the Egyptians adopted it very easily for 2 reasons. One is, first of all, almost all Egyptian gods come in 3s, in trinities. For example, in the town of Memphis, there was a trinity of the god Ptah, his wife Sekhmet, who was a lion-headed goddess, and they have a child called Nefertum, who's a lotus god, comes out on a lotus. So they come in trinities. You have a father, a mother, and a son. In Memphis, those 3. In Thebes, in the south of Egypt, you have another 3. You have Amun, who starts out as the hidden one, remember, in the primordial waters. His wife, Mut, who also has a lion head. And they have a child, Khonsu, a ram-headed god. Another trinity. So St. Mark comes in and says, I'm preaching a trinity. The Egyptians were ready. There's another reason, though, why the Egyptians could adopt the Christian trinity. The Egyptians had a history of polytheism, believing in many gods. They never felt they really had to choose. You know, one of the things that people forget is that monotheism, the belief in one God, is divisive. If you believe in one God, then it's really, I'm right, and those who don't believe in you are wrong. So monotheism, in a sense, is divisive. Polytheism, if you can believe in lots of gods, it's a lot easier in a way. And the Egyptians never felt they had to choose and pick and throw out gods. So St. Mark came in and he said, I've got a trinity. They said, fine. And they adopted the trinity. So these people who converted are called the Copts, from Aegyptos. Now, their language is Coptic. But here's where it gets interesting. St. Mark comes in with Christianity. Says, okay, you guys, you've got to change your religion. Going over to Christianity, we've got a new trinity for you. But you can't use these pagan hieroglyphs anymore for our Christian religion. So the Egyptians, they're still speaking Egyptian, but they're not allowed to write their language in hieroglyphs. They need a new script. It happens at this time, the Greeks had been in Egypt for many years, centuries, ruled for 3 centuries. So Greek was around as a language, and they chose to write their ancient Egyptian language in the Greek alphabet.
Getting there.
So Coptic is really ancient Egyptian written in the Greek alphabet, just kind of spelled out phonetically. That's the last script that we have of ancient Egyptian. Coptic, of course, doesn't appear on the Rosetta Stone, but as you will see, it is the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. Coptic is going to be what doesn't. So now we've gone through the different scripts that ancient Egyptian was written in. Hieroglyphic for the fancy religious texts and official things. Hieratic, it's a little bit faster, has to be written. Demotic, language of the people, written very quickly. And we have Coptic, the language of the Egyptians during the Christian period, written in Greek. Now, the decipherment. As you remember from last time, the Rosetta Stone was taken by the British. They won the war. And the Rosetta Stone is in the British Museum today. You can all visit it. I'll tell you something neat, by the way, that the curator, a friend of mine, Harry James, who used to be the curator, did. It's a stone. It's a large stone. It's about this big, maybe 3 feet high, solid. By the way, it isn't black. It isn't black. Everybody thought it was black for 200 years. It's not. It's kind of red. And it's not basalt, which everybody thought. It's granite. Recently, last couple of years, they were cleaning it, right? It had gotten kind of dirty. And as they cleaned it, they realized there was an awful lot of black ink on it, perhaps from the original inking of the stone when they were making the copies. But then they discovered underneath, it was pinkish. And it's not really black basalt like everybody thought. It's pink Aswan granite. It comes from a quarry in Aswan. They even figured out where the quarry is. So it's not. But anyway, my curator friend, Harry James, who used to be the curator of the Egyptian wing of the museum, decided that everybody should be able to touch the Rosetta Stone. It's kind of neat to be able to touch a bit of history. It's a hard stone. It's not going to hurt it. So it's on display with no glass covering it, and you're allowed to touch it. You can really touch a bit of history there. But it's in the British Museum. But it is going to be, as you will see, the key to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Now, let me say this. Who deciphered the Rosetta Stone and the hieroglyphic language and the Egyptian language in general is a bit of a conjecture. People argue still about it. The main decipherer, there is no question, is a Frenchman, Champollion. And I'll tell you about him in a minute. But he didn't do it by himself. An Englishman really started the job, Thomas Young. And the British like to say that Thomas Young deciphered the Rosetta Stone. So let me tell you about their contributions, and you can decide for yourself. Thomas Young was an amazing genius. He was a physician, trained as a physician, who also came up with the theory of light, right? Studied light, physicist. But he loved languages. That's what he loved most. And as his escape, he set it as his task to decipher ancient Egyptian language. And when the Rosetta Stone was found, he started working. Right? Now, his first big leap, right? 1798, someone had suggested that the kings of Egypt wrote their names in ovals. They had seen ovals carved on the walls with hieroglyphs inside the oval. And they thought that that were the king's names inside. They didn't know for sure. They couldn't read it. But they thought it appeared about right to have a king's name, long enough for a name, frequently enough. So there was a suggestion that the king's names were written in ovals. And they're called cartouches to this day. You know why? Because of Napoleon's expedition. When the men saw these ovals, they said they looked like bullets, right? Standing on their end, a bullet. Imagine a bullet is an oval kind of with a little line on the bottom. And they said, oh, that's a cartouche. That's the French word for bullet, right? So that's why we call them cartouche today, because of Napoleon's soldiers. Now, it had been suggested that the cartouches contained the names of the kings. Thomas Young figured, names can't be picture writing. You can't have a picture, for example, of King Ptolemy. Now, understand this. We had the Greek text on the bottom, right? And the first line of the Greek text, very first line, first two words, Ptolemeo Basileou, King Ptolemy. So the Greek let us know Ptolemy's name is on the Rosetta Stone. Young figured, in the cartouche, those are going to be the letters of Ptolemy's name. And he started thinking it out. He said, there's a little rectangle. That's a hieroglyph. That must be the P. There's a semicircle. That must be the T. There's a loop, like a lasso. That must be the O. There's an owl. Might be an M, right? Or a stand. There's two ways of writing the M. And he went through it, and he worked out the name Ptolemus, the Greek version of Ptolemy. So Thomas Young is one of the first ones to say, you've got an alphabet here. We can figure out the name. Now, often it is said, by the way, that Cleopatra's name is on the Rosetta Stone. It's not. Only Ptolemy's appear. Later they found another inscription with Cleopatra's name, and they used that too. But the important thing to remember is Young figures out, we've got an alphabet, just like ours. Then enter Jean-François Champollion. Champollion was an amazing kid, and I mean kid. His father was a librarian, and Champollion was used to playing in the stacks, in the books. And he always, as a little kid, even crawling around, he was looking at different languages on the spines of the books, trying to understand what they were, and he became almost obsessed with languages. By the time he was like 14 or 15, he knew 8 languages. One of the languages that he knew was Coptic. Coptic had survived. You see, the Copts still exist today in Egypt, and they have a church, the Coptic Church. And if you go to the Coptic Church, I sometimes, when I'm in Egypt, I often do it, I'll stop into a Coptic church and listen to the service. Because when you hear it, you're hearing ancient Egyptian. They've kept the language right through. So Coptic is really our connection with spoken ancient Egyptian. And Champollion knew Coptic. Now, think about this. Thomas Young says it's an alphabet. Great. So we can look at the hieroglyphs and know how it sounded. But that doesn't tell us what it means. For example, you know the hieroglyph that everybody is familiar with? An Ankh. It's like a cross. It has the loop at the top, comes down, crossbar. That's an Ankh. People often wear them as good luck symbols. Everybody knew that that was pronounced Ankh. The ancient Egyptians pronounced it Ankh. From the alphabet, we could figure that out. But how do you know that the ancient Egyptians meant by Ankh the word life? Right? It's the concept life. The answer is in the Coptic Church's liturgy. We know that Ankh means life. So from Coptic, by knowing Coptic, Champollion could look at the hieroglyphs, say it's an alphabet, say it out loud, Ankh, and then realize, Coptic has that word, Ankh, it means life. So that's the connecting thing that enabled Champollion to decipher hieroglyphs, not just phonetically, but get at the meaning of it. And he was the first one to translate the Rosetta Stone. It didn't come easy, by the way. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 during the campaign, brought to England in 1801, was not deciphered until 1822. 1822. It was a long haul, right? But he finally did it. And for the first time, the records of ancient Egypt could be read, thanks to Napoleon and Champollion. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you just how the language worked. But let me explain what was on the Rosetta Stone. What's on it? What does it say? First, the Rosetta Stone is what we call a stela. A stela is simply a large stone, usually 3, maybe 5, sometimes 9 feet high, shaped like a tombstone. They're always rounded at the top, and I really do think that we get our tombstones from that. I think that's where we get the tombstone from. And these were placed in front of temples. Again, kind of like a bulletin board. If you wanted to announce something, if you wanted to say something great was done, you had a stela carved. And the Rosetta Stone, broken as it is, fragmented as it is, right? It's broken, it's not complete, was from originally a stela. It was a large stone erected in front of the temple. Now, it was erected during the reign of the king Ptolemy V, a Greek who was ruling Egypt, right, toward the end of Egyptian civilization. Now, Ptolemy had done a couple of nice things for the priests. He said you don't have to pay certain kinds of taxes. You don't have to make this trip that you always have to make to deposit your taxes. And the priests were very thankful. So what they did was they carved this stela. And they carved it in hieroglyphs because it was important. They carved it in Demotic so the people could read it. And they carved it in Greek so Ptolemy V could read it because he couldn't read Egyptian. The Greeks never learned to read Egyptian when they were ruling. The only Greek who ever learned ancient Egyptian language was Cleopatra. We'll talk about that later. So this Rosetta Stone is basically a thank you letter from the priests of Egypt to Ptolemy V saying, thanks a lot, you're a good guy. Given that we now know what the Rosetta Stone said, and that it was a key to decipherment, I want to go to my last goal for this lecture. I want you to be able to read and write your own names in hieroglyphs. So to do that, you're going to have to know how the language really works. Now, let me start by saying there are three ways a hieroglyphic symbol, can be used. First, it can be used phonetically to represent a sound. For example, if you take the hieroglyph that looks like a hand hieroglyph, they're not talking about hands. That represents the sound D, a D. If you look at the little rectangle hieroglyph, which if you remember was the first hieroglyph in King Ptolemy's name, that's a P. Then you have the little semicircle in Ptolemy's name. That's a T. So those three symbols, the P, the T, and the D, those three, are alphabetic. Just represent a sound. They're not talking about hands and rectangles and semicircles. Now, if we put those three hieroglyphs together, if we form them together, we have a word, D-P-T. The ancient Egyptians didn't write vowels. Many ancient languages don't have vowels. For example, Hebrew did not write the vowels until very late. The reason is that most people were illiterate, and these were just sort of aid memoirs to help you remember things. It wasn't like the formal writing. So DPT, now we don't know how exactly it was pronounced, but let's say call it debit. We'll put it in a little short E so it doesn't sound like Swedish debit or whatever. So we'll say debit. That was a word. It's a phonetic word. Three hieroglyphs used phonetically. Now, the next use of a hieroglyph, right? There are three, remember? We're using it phonetically first. I can also, now by the way, the ancient Egyptian word debit meant boat. It was the word for boat. Now I can also, if I want to clarify what the hand and the rectangle and the semicircle mean, I could, at the end of that word, add a boat, a little picture of a boat. Now that's helping me make clear what the meaning is. I'm using that hieroglyph like a picture of what it is. All right, so the first three hieroglyphs, the D and the P and the T, say boat, debit, and the next one helps clarify it. It determines the meaning for me, helps me determine the meaning. That use of a hieroglyph is called a determinative because it helps determine the meaning of a phonetic word. So that's the second way a hieroglyph can be used. After a bunch of phonetic sounds, giving you a picture of what it is. I mean, for example, if I wrote the word C-A-T, cat, and drew a little cat, the C and the A and the T are phonetic, and a little picture of the cat is helping me determine the meaning. So far we have two ways that hieroglyphic sounds can be used, either phonetically or as a determinative to give you a picture. Now, what if I'm in a real hurry? I don't have time to write the D, the P, the T, draw a little boat. I want to get it done quickly. That's my third use of hieroglyphs. I can simply draw a picture of a boat and put a little line under it, a stroke. And that says, it's a picture, that's all you're getting. That's called an ideogram. It's pictorial writing. This shows that I'm just doing it the fastest way I can. I'm giving you a picture. So, three ways you can use a hieroglyph. Three ways. You can use it either phonetically, represent a sound, as a determinative to help you determine the meaning of a phonetic word, or you can just use it like picture writing, like people always thought it was, just a simple drawing. Now, sometimes the ideograms are used, these ideograms of the picture writing, are used when space is limited. You know, you're running out of space. It's sort of like the plan ahead sign where the head runs off. If you're running out of space, you start using these ideograms. Or, for example, rings. If you want to put your name on a ring, which is a small surface, you might not have the room to spell out Mantu Hotep Herkepchef or something like that. So you might want to try to do an ideogram of something like the god Mantu, a little picture or something like that. You do it in different ways. Right? So 3 different ways, determined often by just sort of the circumstances. Now, one thing I should tell you about Egyptian that I think is just neat. It's the only language I know that can be written either from right to left, or left to right, or top to bottom. They can do it any way they wanted. And the reason is for artistic consideration. Think about a tomb. Let's say you're decorating your tomb, and you have a doorway, and you want to have a religious inscription over the doorway. You want it to say, may I have all the bread and beer and things good and pure that the gods live on. Now, you could write it either from left to right, or right to left. Or, if you want it to be really artistic and have it really symmetrical, you could start at the middle of the door and write one inscription from right to left, reading outwards from the middle. You could start the same inscription in the middle going the other way, and you've got this beautiful symmetrical double rendering of this prayer. And that's why they could write it from right to left or left to right for artistic consideration. They were really into symmetry. Egypt is a very symmetrical land. You've got the Nile going down the middle, you've got the desert on both sides. They loved symmetry. They liked balance. And their language was done that way. Also, if you had a narrow space where you wanted to write something, you could write it from top to bottom. Right? Now, if you want to know how do you read it,
So planting season had started here. Let's get the garden growing. Nice. Yeah, it's getting close for us too. I think we were just now getting our garden all set up.
Always into the mouths of the birds. And that's what always tells you which way to do it. It's never confusing. I know that sometimes it sounds like it might be, but it never is. It's an amazing language. But now, my promise. I said that you would all be able to read and write your names in hieroglyphs before this lecture is over. And here's how we're going to do it. At the end of your outlines is an appendix. I've got the entire Egyptian alphabet for you there. For example, the vulture, the bird, is an A, an ah sound. They didn't have full vowels, it's a semi-vowel. You'll see a foot. A foot is a B sound. You'll see our friend the hand. You'll see hand is D. You'll see the P, the rectangle. You'll see all of that, you'll see. Now, what I want you to do is take that chart, and using that chart, figure out how your name would be written in hieroglyphs. First, you're going to be missing some letters because some vowels aren't there. As I said, the Egyptians don't have many vowels are missing. Just leave them out. And remember, what you're doing is you're not translating your name. We don't call that translating. You're transliterating. Transliterating is taking the sound of your name. That's all you're going by. You don't care about the meaning of your name. That's translating. You're taking the sound of your name and you're writing it in the Egyptian script. So, for example, if your name is Barbara, the first letter you'd look for a B, and that's the foot. So the first letter in your name would be a B. Now, no full vowel, but the vulture, the Egyptian vulture, the bird, is an ah sound. That's close. So you'd put an ah. So you'd have a foot and a vulture. Then you'd have the mouth sign, a little oval, which is R, B-A-R. And you'd repeat it again, B-A-R, because bar, bar. And at the end, you'd have another vulture. So it would be foot, vulture, mouth, foot, vulture, mouth, vulture would be Barbara. Now, you can all do that for all your names. I want you to try it. It'll be fun. Try it out on friends. Write friends' names. And your homework assignment is to write the names, transliterating them in hieroglyphs, of 3 famous people. And then show them to someone else with the chart and see if they can figure out who the people you've written are. So that's your homework assignment. The only time I'll give you a homework assignment during the 48 lectures, but that one I want you to try, and I think you'll find it a lot of fun. So now you should know how the ancient Egyptian language worked, how the Rosetta Stone helped decipher it, and I hope you can write your names in hieroglyphs. I'll see you next time.
6. The first nation in history.
Hi, I've got a question for you. Did you do your homework? Did you write your name in hieroglyphs? And did you write the names of 3 other famous people in hieroglyphs? It's fun, and you can practice it. Keep it going. It's a skill that you'll lose if you don't use it, so keep trying to do it. Now, remember in the first lecture I said that I was going to try to do this chronologically. I was trying to take things in order, but there would be some side trips. Well, the last 2 lectures have been the side trips. We've done Napoleon in Egypt, and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, and then a little bit about how the Rosetta Stone led to decipherment, and something about Egyptian language. Well, I want to return to the chronological approach now. I want to go back to early Egypt. Now, remember we did prehistoric times, 700,000 years and 30 minutes. I want to come now to historic times, the very beginnings of writing in Egypt. And what we're going to discuss today is one document, the first historical document in the world, the Narmer Palette. And we're going to use this document to see a few things about Egyptian civilization. One is we'll see the political setup with a king as the divine ruler of Egypt. And we'll also see why having such a political setup will enable Egypt to do great things. But let me start with Egypt before it was a nation. Right? Now, if you remember back to prehistory, we left Egypt around 3200 BC. A Nile Valley civilization, populated by little villages, maybe 150 people here, 150 people here, perhaps 2,000 in all. We're not sure exactly the numbers. And Egypt was divided into 2 kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. And if you'll remember, Upper Egypt is beneath Lower Egypt because of the way the Nile flows. Well, right at the cusp of history in Egypt, written history, 3200 BC roughly, Upper Egypt seems to be ruled by a king, and Lower Egypt by another king. And they had symbols, crowns. The kings had different crowns. It's interesting, isn't it, that somehow a hat becomes a symbol of authority. And it's remained that. Queen of England, policemen have special hats. Everybody's got special hats. And the kings of Egypt had special hats. In the south, it was the white crown, a tall white crown, kind of conical. In the north, it's the red crown. It's a shorter crown, has a little peak at the back, a little feather curling up in the front. So you have the tall white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. Tell you something really interesting about the crowns, and this is my theory, certainly may be wrong, but you shouldn't take it as fact. The fact is that no crown has ever been found. We do not have the crown of any king of Egypt. For 3,000 years, the pharaohs wore the red and the white crown. None has ever been found. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered intact. Everything he packed in there for the next world was there. No crown. No crown. My theory, and this is the part that really may be wrong, I'll just present it, is that I don't think there was more than one crown in existence at any one time. I think it was a magical thing. The crowns were believed to have actual magical powers. And I think it was the one thing that when a pharaoh died, he couldn't take with him to the next world. His successor got the crown. So I think there was probably only one red crown and one white crown in existence at any one time. And that's why it wasn't found in Tutankhamun's tomb. But that's just a theory. But the important thing is that very early on in Egyptian history, these crowns were the symbol of power. Now, there was probably some communication between Upper and Lower Egypt, but it was limited. Travel wasn't easy, remember, in ancient Egypt. You had the Nile. That was a good way to go long distances, but the common man certainly couldn't afford a boat. And the only other way you went anyplace in Egypt was donkey. It was the donkey for the short haul and boats for the long haul. So communication was probably limited. But then, around, the best guess is 3150 BC, right? 3150 BC. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt is unified. It becomes one country, right? One country. And how is it unified? Apparently, by a king from the south conquering in the north. And that king's name is Narmer. And we have an object called the Narmer palette, which is what I call the first historical document in the world. It tells of the unification of Egypt. And what I want to do today is tell you about the Narmer palette and how it tells the story of the unification of Egypt. Now first, about the palette itself. It's a palette that's about 2 feet high, and it's made of slate,
Yeah, making
but isn't an ordinary
a
slate
giant
palette. Now,
Kathy
as you
Griffin
remember,
spider.
ordinary Egyptians used palettes for grinding their cosmetics. They would take a little bit, for example, of carbon, charcoal from a fire, mix it with fat, and grind it on the palette, and that became eye makeup. It's the first cosmetics in the world. And they would put it under their eye. And also, in desert countries, it helps absorb the glare. It's not just decorative. That's why when you look at football players, they're wearing basically eye makeup under their eyes, black, to absorb the glare so it doesn't go into your eye. So this is not one of those palettes, though. This is a highly decorated, carved palette. It's what we call a ceremonial palette. It was probably never used in a house. It's too big, it's too fancy, it's too elaborate. It was probably a temple object. It may have even been used to grind the cosmetics for a statue of the gods. See, every temple, in the back of the temple, had an area called the Holy of Holies, a shrine where only the priests could go. And in that Holy of Holies was a bronze statue of the god, whoever was the god of that temple. So if it was Amun, it would be a statue of Amun. And the priests, every morning, would throw open the doors and anoint the statue with oils, cosmetics, give it an offering of foods, then close the doors. This may have been a palette that was used to anoint the gods. It's really big, beautiful, and important. But it tells a story, and that's why I say it's the first historical document in the world. Now, the palette does a few things for us. First, it's the beginnings of language. This is where we get our first real hieroglyphs telling a story. Another thing is it sets a kind of artistic convention,
in
artistic style
Rollins
that
chicken.
is going to last for 3,000 years.
What does that mean?
This is where we're going to see the king as a symbol of Egypt. See, the king is really the way you said Egypt. He was the icon. Egypt meant the pharaoh. He was that
Brooke
central.
Rollins.
The pharaoh's role was to keep divine order in the world. See, the Egyptians had this strong concept of divine order. That there was a certain order, and Egypt was on top of that order. And the king's job was to make the right offerings to the gods.
Oh
Make
shit,
sure that
I'm
the gods
getting
were pleased
tired.
and divine order would stay. So the king is the symbol of Egypt. Now, in addition, not only is he the symbol of Egypt, he's presented in what we call hierarchical proportion. The king
All right,
is
man.
bigger
I
than
think
everybody.
I'm gonna
When you look
go
on
to
a temple
bed now
wall, everybody's not the same size. The king
because
is about 4 or 5
I
times
thought
the
I couldn't
size
sleep, but
of
now
a commoner.
like I'm feeling
And he's
very
almost
tired
the same
after
size
just
as the
doing a
gods,
couple legs.
because he is a god on earth. He is the god Horus on
But
earth.
I'm gonna go to bed.
On this Narmer palette,
So
we
have
see
yourself a
king
good
who
one,
is
man.
larger than everybody else, and he is the symbol of Egypt. Now, let me tell you what is on this palette.